Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Good morning. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection, with a very, very important show. Today's title is Phoenix, Its Hispanic Roots. And many know the history of Phoenix, but I'm sure that there are many, many more that do not know the history of Phoenix. And not only Phoenix, but the state of Arizona. So today, we have great guests, very knowledgeable, and people that have been here for a long time in this area. And we are going to carry out a conversation about this important issue. It is very important to understand history. I honestly am in love with history. I am trying to retire early so that I can dedicate myself to learning history a bit more, because I think history is super, super important to know. So we have a great guest, and before I introduce them, let me read something that I have here on a slide. It's a little comment. It says, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Hispanics, Chicanos, Latinos, different names, right, have been in Arizona and in Phoenix specifically forever. They were here before Arizona became part of the United States, before Arizona became a state of this country in 1912, and before Phoenix became a city. At some point, many Mexicans became U.S. citizens, on the one hand, and foreigners in their own land on the other. Through migration, many more moved north to Arizona, and eventually, Phoenix was founded. And we would have a conversation today about this journey. And our guests are going to be helping us to develop this subject, these concepts. And let me start, first of all, to my left. Frank Barrios, Mexicans in Phoenix. Frank, thank you. And I really appreciate that every time I call on you, you are ready to come.
It's a pleasure to be here and basically educate people on what was here, the Mexican community, all of the contributions they made to this great city that we have today. And I always glad to be here and sort of tell the history of how we got to where we're at.
Strong foundation for being here or not?
Absolutely.
All right. We also have Julian Reveles. And Julian, I understand did you have a radio show before, or can you tell us just a little bit of that? First of all, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, yeah. Well, I have a journalistic background. I got my radio and television and journalism credit from Arizona State University back in antediluvian days. And I was on KTAR radio, which was the NBC affiliate, and on television as well, primarily on radio. And we had a history show where we talked a little bit about Phoenix, but primarily the entertainment. What did our forefathers and families do for entertainment? We already had mention of the Riverside Ballroom.
That's going to be very interesting. We're going to have to ask you all kinds of questions about the entertainment in the good old days, right?
Theaters and all of that, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. And to my right, I have Mona Lucero. And Mona, thank you so much. Last minute, we were looking for a lady. We had all gentlemen and said, we need ladies in this show. Thank you so much. By the way, Anita Ritter helped me to find you, because I don't think we met before.
No, we
but
haven't.
I'm so
in
glad.
Fact, Anita's was a very good friend of my mom and dad's growing up.
Wow, Anita seems like she knows everybody, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Mona, thank you so much. And you were telling me that your family goes back 5 or more generations?
We go back at least 5 generations. Right now, there are 7 generations of us.
That is amazing.
My grandmother and grandfather, actually, my maternal grandfather and grandmother came from Clarkdale, Jerome area.
Jerome.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then they came down in the 30s, and my grandmother was a housekeeper, and my grandfather worked for Maricopa County.
Right. So when I think of my family, I was born in Mexico and came to the United States when I was 12 years old. I always think of Zacatecas, Jalisco. So when you have to talk about your family, what do you talk about? Jerome, California,
Yeah, well,
Texas?
mostly Jerome and Clarkdale. It's and people are just amazed. You know, they can't believe I was born here, because nobody was born in Phoenix. But I was born at Good Sam. But my grandparents, they were from, like I said, Clarkdale, Jerome. One cool thing was whenever we'd have a family get together, both sides of the family knew each other, and I thought that's how everybody was. I didn't realize, you know, most families, the two sides didn't know each other. So growing up, it was really neat because, you know, my entire family knew, on my mother's side, everybody knew everybody.
Yeah, you know, and it seems like culture is something that develops, and I mean the experience of culture. The close, like me, my kids are first generation Americans on my side. They're second generation American on my wife's side. But for me and for them, we're very close still to Mexico. So when we talk, you know, our cultural makeup, it's still both countries, but there's still a strong emphasis on Mexico. I assume the ones you're seventh generation American, it's a little different, do you think?
It is different, even though we do keep our culture tight to us. That's very, very important, and that was very, very important to me to teach my son about where we come from.
Right.
But still, very proud to be here. It's just kind of funny, you know, because we've always been here. We've never. I don't have any relatives that I can trace back to Mexico at this point.
Have you heard of Benito Juárez?
Oh yeah.
Pancho Villa?
Yeah.
Emiliano Zapata?
Well, of course. I mean, that was part of the love of my culture and getting to know my culture. You know, it was very important. For many years, I didn't realize how young a country Mexico actually is. So that was of great interest to me.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. I remember in the movie Selena, Edward James Olmos saying something about how the Americans don't want us and the Mexicans don't want us, so we're kind of in a lost land. You know?
Pobrecitos, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, and we'll continue in just a bit. Charlie Cano and Karen, I think. Karen is your wife's daughter, correct?
No, Karen was referred my name to my sister, to my cousin's wife.
Okay.
And she wanted her husband to come here, and because he's radio shy, you know, she asked me to come, and I said, "Yeah, I'll be more than happy to do it." You know, I felt that I could add something to the discussion. You know, I'm from the era of the baby boomers. You know, and as far as the history of the Cano legacy. I have a brother that was more or less a historian, and so I quizzed him before I came over here.
Is he still with us?
Oh yeah.
Oh, we need to speak to him and bring him one day.
Oh yeah, one of these days, you know. But he has a lot to talk about as far as the family, you know, which originated when you mentioned Zacatecas. That's where the family originated, the Canos.
Right.
And it came to be that my grandmother came from a very wealthy family. They owned a lot of property in Zacatecas, and she got involved with one of the peasants there. And she was given an ultimatum to either, you know, leave this guy or move out of the house. Well, she took the latter. So they started a pilgrimage, you know, going north, you know, through Juárez into and eventually ended up here through Texas, New Mexico, and here. And then from here, our grandparents took ill, and then the family dispersed. Some went into California, others stayed here. So that's how our family more or less got started.
So if you had to tell us, are you first generation, second generation American?
Well, I would say maybe about third generation.
Third generation.
Yeah,
American.
you know, that because our grandparents died in 1933. And they were buried in this cemetery that we
So
were
they
talking
were
about
born
earlier.
in the 1800s.
Yeah,
Definitely.
And buried in that Cementerio Lindo, which is located just north of.
Is that the name?
Yeah, that's the name, right, Frank?
Cementerio Lindo.
Yes, that it had several names, but
Yeah.
the last name that sticks with it is Cementerio Lindo.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's located just north of the Maricopa Freeway on 15th Avenue, and that's where they were buried.
So,
And what I wanted to bring to the table, excuse me, but what I wanted to bring to the table was just the personal experiences of growing up in the Phoenix area, and I can share with some of my counterparts, that were born in this, the baby boomers or even some earlier, because I got out in the streets a lot when I was real young, so I used to hang out in bars when I was 15 years old sometimes.
you wouldn't call yourself a troublemaker.
I wasn't
would
a
you?
troublemaker,
Okay.
but I was there before the trouble started,
Thank you, and we'll
Yeah?
come back to you.
Okay.
We'll come back. This is amazing. This is just amazing, and it is just amazing. Frank, help us understand the history, because Arizona has had several owners, if you will. I don't know if this is a good way to put it, but it has had certain or different owners. Can you help us understand that process and how Arizona became eventually a state of this country and so on?
Glad to. The first people that came into this area were the Hohokam. And the historians believe they came out of Mexico looking for an area where they could irrigate, and they developed all this land. And then by the time the Spanish came into Arizona, the Hohokam had already disappeared. They were in ruins in the area.
Now, before we move on, the Hohokam, they built canals big time, I understand?
That's correct. They had a system of irrigation, and they were very advanced, probably one of the most advanced prehistoric cultures of all of Arizona. They came in with and were irrigating out from the Salt River. There's Hohokam in the Tucson area. They irrigated from the Santa Cruz, and they developed a very high culture similar to Mexico. They even found pyramids that they had the same, not quite like you see in Mexico City, but it was the same type of beliefs. They had no written language, so there's no way of knowing much about them. But when the Spanish first came into this area, they found the ruins of the Hohokam. They had already left.
Right.
And, of course, Mexico, the Spanish claimed all of the area of Arizona, and then came the War of 1848.
So at that point, the state of Arizona, and I understand California, Nevada, Texas, Utah, were basically Mexico.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. But actually, Texas was a little bit before that when they had the Alamo and all of that. But it wasn't necessarily part of the United States. It was the Texans wanted a separate country almost. Later it became part of the United States. But California, Arizona, New Mexico were all claimed by Mexico as part of their territory. And in actuality, the strength of Mexico and Arizona was south of the Gila River. And north of the Gila River, the Apaches were pretty dominant. And so they had forts and so on, but they were claiming all of the area. Then came the war with Mexico. Mexico lost California.
The Mexican-American War, correct?
That's correct.
And I have the date here. Do you recall it by heart?
1848.
Okay.
And it was war with Mexico, and Marines entered Mexico City. They won the war, and New Mexico, parts of Arizona, what is Arizona today, and all of California became part of the United States. They only took from Mexico the part of the Arizona north of the Gila River. The area south of the Gila River was still part of Mexico.
This is part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, correct?
That's correct, when that all ended. But later, what they did was the United States decided they wanted a straight border between Mexico and the United States, and so they started negotiating with Mexico about purchasing some of the land south of the Gila River. And Mexico had two large communities in those areas. One was Tucson, and the other was the Yuma area. And so these were people that were Mexican citizens and part of Mexico. And the United States came in and said, we want to buy all of that land south of the Gila River so we can have a straight border between Mexico and the United States. And of course, my understanding, there were several. One of them was Mexico at the time needed money because it was after the war, and they were even willing to sell parts of Sonora and Chihuahua.
Wow.
But the United States, I always remember reading this, they said, why would we want to buy any of that desert land? It's worthless. So we're going to take the lease we can, and the lease was the area from the border today to the Gila River.
And that's the Gadsden Purchase, correct?
That's
and
correct.
there is a town in by Somerton called Gadsden, right?
That's correct.
That is so interesting. We have to go on break, and we'll continue. We'll pick up on that conversation. You're listening to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. I am your host, David Parra. And with us today, a group of 4 guests that are helping us to carry out a conversation about the journey, all the experiences that people of Mexican descent have had here in the Phoenix, in Arizona, in fact. Now, Frank, if we can come back, so basically, due to the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Gadsden Purchase, we find that many Mexicans became literally U.S. citizens from one day to the next, and they've used the phrase "foreigners in their own lands." All of a sudden, they found themselves literally in another country.
Dr. Pete Dimas always used to say, I didn't cross the border crossed me.
Is he the one that says that?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's true. And also, you might understand that in those days, making a living was tough. And people from Mexico would cross back and forth. There was no real definitive border. There was on paper. But in reality, people would cross from Mexico looking to make a living. And you had Mexican who were part of Mexico and agreed to become U.S. citizens and were in Arizona. But you also had Mexicans that were crossing back and forth. They get married. They would come across looking for jobs. And at the same time, later on, you had immigrants from Europe that were coming into Arizona. Everybody the same
Not
thing.
necessarily Anglo-Saxon from the East. Are you saying
No.
immigrants from Europe coming?
And one of the things in those early years, after the war with Mexico, there was, I think you call them soldiers of fortune. After the war is over, they're discharged. They didn't go back to, they stayed in this area looking to make a living. So on both sides, probably, the Mexican army too. This was, war was with Mexico.
Okay.
This was a war with Mexico, and you had Mexicans, Mexican Americans, both interchange. Spanish was spoken as much as English in most of these immigrants that came in or after the war. They all spoke Spanish to be able to get through.
Right.
It was very difficult to come to Arizona from any other part from the east because it was a long trip, dangerous trip. But the Mexicans could cross back and forth. Many of the people from Yuma were in Phoenix, Tucson also. So you have this mixture of people, Mexican Americans, with Spanish being spoken very strongly through all this area.
Yeah. And Julian, are you familiar with the Historic Hispanic Property Survey? Because I know La Doctora Christine Marin sent me a PDF of this so-called property survey that to me looks more like a history book. And she sent me the PDF, and I really want to make it available to the whole world. She says I could do it. And your name is in there. Can you tell us what this Historic Hispanic Property Survey is?
Well, I was a part of it, as was Frank, as you mentioned. And we had a lot of fun with that. Gene Reynolds, I think, was the instigator, one of the people that brought it over first. And she wanted to know what it was that, our La Raza, our people did back in the day, not only for entertainment, but their occupation and like that. And so we interviewed, as Frank said, an awful lot of individuals. We all had contacts, a lot of family members. I come from a family of 13, so by extension, there was an awful lot of deals.
So I understand they interviewed something like 14 people, correct?
Yeah, basically.
Right. And then they produced this report, and I have it on PDF. I really, if you're listening by radio, join AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection, on Facebook. I'm going to post it there. Or write me an email to dparra@aarp.org. I'll be happy to send you this PDF. It's about 178 pages. And just since we're talking about that, Frank wrote Mexicans in Phoenix. This is a book that talks about the history. It is critical to learn the history.
Very, very much so. Yeah, we had it was very, very interesting talking to these individuals, and most of them are gone now, but they have still have some very vivid memories of what they did for entertainment and how they lived in the barrios. And I interviewed an awful lot of people that I knew from my own neighborhood, the Grant Park neighborhood, and got to know these people a lot better at that time, because we did have this, as many years later, the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, talked about how it takes a village, to raise a family. And I always kind of felt that way with our neighborhood, our barrio, the Grant Park neighborhood, and that all of my aunts and uncles all lived within a radius of maybe 3 miles. And so all the cousins and all of us grew together. It was an extended family.
So since you touched about that, let's fast forward real fast, almost like to, well, it would be what, in the 60s, 70s?
Yes, it would be, yeah.
Can you help us understand, based on your family's experience, the life in those days, according to your own experience or your parents' experience, especially the issue of the barrios? Are you aware of that? I assume you are. Yeah. There was a part of the history of Phoenix that was very marked by very concrete barrios, right? Actually, I even have the names. Go ahead.
I'm not going to go through the names, but there's about 9 recognized barrios back in those days. And unfortunately, as we were talking earlier, the barrio that I grew up in, which was bordered from north, there was the railroad tracks, and south to Buckeye Road, west 15th Avenue, and to the east was 11th Avenue. And mainly because it was very integrated, surprisingly. We had in every street corner we had a Chinese store. And there was a Chinese family who lived there. There was an Italian individual that lived there. And then a lot of mixture of people of color and Mexicans. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the thing is, it was in the Maravilla Garden area. There was a bar there. There was a hangout for most of these people, and the majority of these people found employment with this one industry called Capital Metals. That was located near the railroad tracks, again on 15th Avenue. And because of the fact that it created so much pollution, mm-hmm. that in the evening you couldn't see the sun, because of the smoke that would go up. Wow. And eventually got moved up to the Kyrene area up in Tempe, I guess, or Guadalupe area. Mm-hmm. Got moved out there. But we had some experiences there in the neighborhood that, that are kind of noteworthy. At one time, there were storage tanks, fuel storage tanks that were, again, located near the railroad tracks and on 15th Avenue that blew up in 1949. Mm. And they had to evacuate a lot of the people. Well, the Mexicans didn't understand the evacuation process, and the dangers involved. So the law enforcement had a hard time trying to get these people out of their houses, And fortunately, it didn't spread. They were able to bring it back down, to where it should be, and got it controlled. I don't know if Frank remembers a time that then, back in 1949, in fact, my cousin, and I won't mention him by name, they decided to go into the corrals where there were some bulls in there. They were being transported from one location to another, and somebody left the gate open.
Wow.
And so the bulls escaped, and they were in our neighborhood running around all over the place. You know? And then I thought that was kind of unique. I had to go inside, stay inside, and you could see the bulls running around over there. I mean, they were panicked, because they were trying to. So they brought in some caballeros, on horseback, and they were able to round them up,
Yeah.
So.
We are almost up for our second break. Mona, can we come to you? And 5-7 generations is amazing. I'm sure that you have family gatherings, and the stories that you probably share are just amazing. Can you kind of just relate to us some memories or some experiences that you've learned about your family?
Well, my maternal grandparents, they lived right by Central Park, just on 2nd Street in Buckeye. So we did spend a lot of time with Grandma and Grandpa there. Family gatherings were amazing. In my maternal grandmother's side, there were 4 children, and I believe there's 9 of us cousins. And it was just a blast. We were just play. I remember every Christmas, we'd all go early Christmas Eve morning and help my grandma make tamales. Christmas Eve night, go back and eat. And there was this little itty bitty table and I don't know how we got around this table, but there were 9 little kids that sat around this table. It's about the size of a coffee table. So that's one of my favorites. My dad was a heavy equipment operator. He was in construction. So I was very grateful to the fact that he would take us for rides all over the city. I didn't grow up in the barrio. I grew up around 27th Street and Thomas, but Dad took us everywhere. Some days we were up on Camelback Mountain. Other days he'd take us for a ride out to Gilbert. Other days we were in South Phoenix. So I was very happy that he did that. We'd go to Encano Park. I remember my first communion. We went and took pictures out at Encano Park, and I still have those pictures. Just watching the city grow, watching the city change. It's kind of sad, though, too. I miss it. I believe my earliest memory is probably my mom taking all the girl cousins to the Fox Theater downtown to see Snow White.
Wow.
The cartoon Snow White. Wow. So, yeah, I loved how downtown used to be. I loved when we'd get on the bus and go downtown.
You're young, and even at your young age, you've seen a big transformation of the city of Phoenix, I suppose.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing, huh?
I remember when Sing High was down by the railroad tracks, we'd go eat there. Now it's moved closer to the ballpark. Matador, same thing, was down there. I've seen a lot of changes. I think the city's changing too fast. I'd like to see a lot of that stay the old way it was.
Right. We'll come back to you. The names of the barrios is Grand Park, Harmon Park, and Marcos de Niza, El Campito, Central Park, La Sonorita, Cuatro Milpas, and Golden Gate.
Well, the other comment is that there were actually some cities in there, too. Santa Rosa was on 19th Avenue in Glendale. It was a little community. There were these communities where Mexican farm workers lived, and they had names. There was these barrio areas, but there also were actual little cities of Mexicans in the valley.
And we'll continue with that conversation. We have to go on our second break. You're listening to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. The subject today is Phoenix. It's Hispanic roots, and definitely lots of roots and deep roots that Hispanics. And I mentioned on the first segment different names that people use to talk about Latinos. There's Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Hispanics, Latinos. Now they also use Latinx. it's evolving. And Frank, a program is just not enough to cover everything that you cover in your book, and that the survey project that we referenced earlier covers 78 pages, and I really want to make that available online. But I know that you've said in the past that Mexicans help build, let's be more specific, Phoenix. How did that happen?
In the earliest years, when there was half the population of Phoenix was Mexican American, there were some very influential Mexican Americans that Peralta owned the largest trading store. Ortero was one of the richest men in Phoenix. But as the Mexican Revolution, people were crossing the border, and there's probably the labor force for the valley was heavily, whether it be in agriculture, whether it be construction, in every aspect. There were the Mexican Americans were there to contribute to the development of Phoenix, and of course one of the things that changed is once the railroad was completed to Phoenix, then you had people from the east coming in, and Arizona went from having close to half the population Mexican American to becoming a minority.
Yeah,
and,
before we move into the railroad, because the railroad marked a very, very concrete before and after in the history. So you're saying that immigrants or Mexican Americans were heavily involved in construction, agriculture. I read about the canals, and the homes used to be made of brick, so there was a lot of bricks that had to be made. And then they were heavily involved in commerce as well. There were people who were businessmen and involved in trades, etc. So they were very, very much involved in the development of what came to be known as Phoenix, correct?
Correct. And just to give you an example, the big changes that occurred in Phoenix occurred after World War II, when many Mexican Americans died in service to this country. And they came back and found discrimination, found areas that they couldn't participate in, and you started things like the Mexican Chamber of Commerce, which later became the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And again, this was businessmen who wanted to look after the interests of the Mexican business people. Mm-hmm. And then post-41, soldiers who came together, they wanted to buy property and found that there were properties that said no Mexicans allowed. And they got involved and changed that.
So the railroad, when it was built and brought to the state, that changed what?
It basically brought people from the south, from the east, who came into Arizona and wanted everything to be just like where they came from. Mm-hmm. And they found Mexican businesses. One of the first things in 1915, after the railroad was completed, they wanted to pass laws English only. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the Latino community created La Liga Protectora and to protect the interests of Mexican businesses. Mm-hmm. But this friction continued, but the change actually didn't occurred after World War II. That's when, again, when Mexicans died protecting this country, and they were told they could live only in certain places, or they were told where they could eat. And
right.
So much of this occurred that change started to occur.
Now, we usually give credit to post-41. Were they, in terms of the veterans, the main group that started to literally advocate and became very active?
The Hispanic Chamber of Commerce did a lot also.
Okay.
And but post-41 was they wanted to see change under Pipas Fuentes and Danny Martinez. They came in and started activism, and were very, very prominent in getting change done.
Now, we would like to come to entertainment, but I really want you to help us understand the concept of south of Van Buren. I mean, every time we talk about the history of Phoenix, this concept of south of the railroad tracks. What created that concept?
Well, before the flood of 1891 was the largest flood that ever recorded through the Phoenix area. It was 300,000 cubic feet per second, which is a lot of water. The water from the Salt River, I've got pictures in my book that show the water at First Street and Jefferson from the Salt River. That's several miles. And all of a sudden, the people were with homes and property south of Phoenix. Their property wasn't worth so much because they found out it was in a flood zone. So if you had money, you would start building north of Phoenix.
North of Van Buren.
But the property became of less value, and as minorities, Mexican farm workers could afford land south of Phoenix. You had Chinese, blacks that were coming in that also could buy cheaper land south of Phoenix. So the stigma came after that people were buying cheaper land south of Phoenix, and north of Phoenix was people with more money. They knew they were not in the floodplain.
Got it. And Julia, now coming to you, you told us that you really were into the entertainment world. Help us paint the picture for us of how entertainment used to be in those days. And
Well, I think the most popular form of entertainment were all of the movie theaters. You know, we alluded to them earlier, the Fox Theater and like that. But there were three theaters that particularly catered to Mexicanos. And that was the Rex Theater, the Azteca, which came back around 1947, went way back, and then there was the Ramona, which Frank's grandfather founded, and I went there an awful lot to see Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and Tarzan. But before that, it was interesting that within our same family, my dad used to talk about going to the Ramona and especially the Azteca to see Cantinflas and Jorge Negrete and Maria Felix and all of those immortals of Mexican movies. And so it was like these two little worlds that we lived in. But those movie theaters made a big, big impression on me. One of them was monetarily because my two older sisters, we come from a large family, and my two older sisters were cashiers. One was at the Ramona, and the other one was at the Azteca. And so guess who got to go in for free, you know? And even free popcorn and the whole bit. So,
wow.
So if only by osmosis, you know, this whole world of entertainment became a very, very big part of my my being and my sister's
how about
work.
music, dancing?
Well, the dancing, they were probably the most popular venues were the Riverside Ballroom, and certainly the American Legion. Everybody went to the American Legion. Later, Pipas, not later, but at about the same time, Pipas and like that. And then after a while, you know, we also recognized, and certainly I did, because I always had a great love for jazz, and there wasn't a lot of jazz in my barrio. But I recognized that there were some places, you know, above Van Buren, and I was allowed to go there. And we caught a lot of those places like Chez Nous and the Clown's Den and Joe Hunt's and Scottsdale. But primarily the movie theaters, the radio stations. We had KIFN, which was the very, very first Mexican station to come to Phoenix, and that was in 1949, right there by the Riverside Ballroom. And I even worked there for a while, translating commercials from Spanish into English and vice versa. And that was a big, big place. Syed's Ballroom. My mom and dad used to go dancing at Syed's, which is about where the townhouse is now on Central and Thomas Road. And before that, it was the Mirador Ballroom. Then it became Syed's, and Anglo started going there to a large degree, but it was primarily the Mirador in the early days, yeah.
Right. Frank, I know that the Mexican-American community was very active too, and in your book and even in this survey, there are some key figures of people who began to run for office. I know you mentioned Garfias and then the story of Adam Diaz. I mean, the first councilman in Arizona. Just briefly, we're almost going on a break. Can you share
very
a
briefly?
little
Adam
bit?
Diaz was elected to a city council in 1953. And before that, there was no city councilman, Mexican-American even though we had this large population. So Adam broke that. And the first elected state legislator was in 1949 and was a gentleman from Tucson that ran and was elected. And then, of course, we had the governor, Raul Castro,
Of course.
Born in Mexico, illegally came to the United States and got his citizenship and became governor of the state of Arizona.
Right.
And Joe Eddie Lopez is another one. He was on the Board of Supervisors, state legislature, ran for Congress, but did not make it. The first elected congressman from Arizona was Ed Pastor, who just retired recently.
Right. And I read a little bit about Adam Diaz's family. Apparently, they participated in the fight, if you will, against Porfirio Diaz in Veracruz, and they basically continued to move north until they came to Flagstaff, and then eventually to Phoenix. So even Adam Diaz's parents, they were very engaged in a more, I don't know, aggressive or whatever, a difficult situation in Mexico, and they eventually made it to Phoenix. So it is just amazing. I mean, when you read, when one reads your book and this survey that I'm going to make available, it is just, the stories that you read, it's just impossible to convey them in a radio show. So we're going to have to do some reading too, but it's just amazing how, and then of course, even currently we have many. I'm still looking for a way to have the state legislators. Do you realize how many we have, or Latinos are in the state legislators? Really, really good number of them.
And it's always amazing that Arizona Mexicans, Mexican Americans, developed a lot different than in other states. You had New Mexico; they call them manitos, and they developed differently. You got California, where the nickname was pochos,
right.
But in Arizona, it was as though that border didn't exist. People crossed back and forth, and in Arizona, Mexican Americans were identical to people living in Sonora.
Who's considered the father of Phoenix?
The father of Phoenix,
Jack
Swilling.
And who was the wife?
Trinidad Escalante Swilling.
So she's considered the mother of Phoenix?
And she was born in Hermosillo, Sonora.
Right. Interesting and amazing. We'll be right back. You're listening to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. The subject today, Phoenix, its Hispanic roots. This is the last segment, and we kind of have to go a little quicker. Segregation. I don't believe that you can talk about minorities and not address this issue, because there seems to affect many of the minorities, and I'm sure the Latinos or Mexican American went through it. Would you mind, Charlie?
The fact is that the neighborhood that we grew up in, was very mixed with people of color and Mexican. And in fact, I attended during my school years of the 5th and 6th grade Dunbar, which was predominantly black. So when my mom did not want me to continue in middle school, so she talked to the principal of Grace Court School. At that time, it was called Adams School, and talked to the principal, Mr. Tate, to see if he could make an exception so I could attend Adams School at the time, because of the fact she didn't really appreciate the way I was growing up. So anyway, I ended up over there, and there was a lot of prejudice there, in the fact that during my first engagement with segregation was the fact that we were sent there to go to either if we lived on the north side of Grant, we went to Grace Court School, which is Adams, and we lived on the south side. We would go to Bethune. So my mom, like I said, went and had a talk with the principal. But in the first 7th grade, the teachers were segregated us and put all the Mexicans. There was a few Indians, a few Chinese, and they put it on one side of the classroom, and then the Anglos on the other side. And so that was the thing is, in the swimming pool there was we could not go swimming at the University Park, which was located on Van Buren. There were certain times that we could go swimming there, but there was a break before the Mexicans could get in the pool. Imagine that. So a lot of the areas that we visited, like when I was in high school, even. Okay, this was back in 1961. I had a girlfriend that lived in because of the expansion of the airport. Okay, they got relocated to 32nd Street and Indian School. And so that family ended up over there, but, we were still boyfriend and girlfriend and stuff like this. And so I had my friend drive me there, and we got stopped right there on 32nd Street and Thomas, and we were not allowed to continue on until we made a phone call and her parents had to come by and vouch for the fact that we could go further to go see her. Those are the kind of prejudice that we ran across.
Mona, any experiences? When I went to junior high in East Los Angeles, and I remember I used to be called Mexican, TJ, wetback, bracero, and frijolero. Those are like the 5 phrase words that I was called. And at 12 years old, you kind of say, what is this all about, right? But I kind of was called those names. But it was interesting that the people who actually called me those names, they were Mexican Americans. Yeah. It's very interesting because there's a dynamic of Mexican American and all that. But in your experience, any prejudice that you experienced?
A little. I grew up around 27th Street and Thomas, so I ended up going to Lafayette Elementary School, which is now Larry C. Kennedy, and I went to Camelback. Both schools were predominantly white. I did have a little bit of trouble, not much. Luckily, I had a father that taught me well and taught me how to handle that. And
how to handle that?
Actually, very gracefully, without being really rude. Well, I was probably a little rude. But he just taught me what to say and put people in their place. In fact, in my freshman year, I had a wonderful English teacher who noticed that there was a boy and I went to grade school with this boy, and in grade school we were fine. But in high school, I don't know what got to him, but he felt every day he needed to say something to me about being Mexican. And my English teacher, who was white, she noticed. And every day this boy would pick on me. And one day, I guess she got fed up with it, and she gave me permission to turn around and say something to this boy in class, in front of everybody. And I did, and it shut him up. Never heard a peep out of him again.
Amazing.
And she had my back, and she said, I will give you permission to tell you whatever you need to tell him, and then this will be dropped.
I have one quick story. In 1950, my parents, I went 8 years to St. Mary's Grammar School here in Phoenix, Catholic school. And my mother brought me to sign me up for in 1950 for St. Mary's. And the teacher said, well, his last name is Barrios. That's Hispanic. My mother said, yes, it is. And he said, well, he can't come to St. Mary's. He's got to go to Immaculate Heart. And this policy that they developed had a big uproar throughout the community because of previous things that had occurred with the Catholic Church. And so the bishop found out about it. The bishop came down, stopped it immediately, and that policy changed. But the fact that friends of my family left the church over that issue because they had felt so strongly that the whole issue previously of Immaculate Heart and St. Mary's was developed. But it was interesting. It started, but the bishop in Tucson stopped it, and it never occurred again at St. Mary's.
We have about 5 more minutes, and I'm going to ask the last question, and don't take more than a minute to explain. The question is, if someone who is not Latino wants to find out what it is to be Mexican American, how do you know you're Mexican American? What does it feel? What is it like? You want to help somebody who's not a Latino understand you as a Mexican American. How are you American? Yes. Are you Mexican? Yes. How do you know? How does that look like? How does that feel?
I would mention, and I've been across this before, ran across this before, and I tell them that a lot of the cultures, that the Anglos have nowadays that were derived from the Mexican cultures. A lot of the Western wear, that you see in the music, and that you see in the drab that they wear, originated from Mexico. The cowboy hats and all that. So, to me, it's an honor, the fact that we have our culture, and yes, we are losing it, but to be able to be a part of when somebody uses a word, that trying to distinguish where you came from. It's easy for us to distinguish where we came from because we have the appearance and we have the language.
So maybe on our end, it's very easy to know that we're Mexican. How does it feel to be American for you? What? Yeah.
I feel very proud because I served in the military. I served for the best country in this world. There's a lot of politics, but we'll always have politics. But the thing is, we have survived for over 200 years. Under the independence, and we will survive again.
Yes.
And that's why I feel so proud to be an American, to be a Latino, or as I refer to as Mexican. Okay.
Good.
I always like to remember real quickly what my dad used to say to us when he was trying to get us to speak both languages, and he would say, a man who can speak both English and Spanish, and of course he meant a woman as well, is worth 2, You've got 2 languages to be proud of. So my dad was always very insistent that we not forget his language, And my mom was she was in the middle. We could communicate with my mom in English, but with my dad, we pretty much knew that we had to speak Spanish to him. I remember one time I even said okay to him, and he got mad at me.
Wow.
And I said, because he was being a little facetious, Right. But with my mom, she could let us speak both languages, and I love it because we grew up bilingual.
Right.
Of course, going to the movies with Cantinflas.
You would watch English movies and Spanish movies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's go to Mona, and then we come back to Frank. We're running out of time, but I think we still have enough.
With me, it's just part of keeping my culture alive. I did dance folklorico. That was very important to me. My son, the same thing. With my son, I made sure that he both, Mexican and American music. We love all kinds of music, and that's one thing I did instill in him. It is very important. A lot of my friends are into the lowriders. That's part of our culture too, being a younger Mexican American. It's a love.
Yeah.
It's something that's in our heart, and it's something that I love to share with
Are you
others.
into politics?
A little.
Okay. So you're Mexican American is just a normal thing. Sometimes you switch back and forth, 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 different types of food. You eat American food, Mexican food, of course.
Yes, was raised with speaking both English and Spanish as a child. Always understood Spanish, never spoke it until I really got into high school. My grandmother, that's all she would speak.
Right.
So it's been part of my life.
Frank?
It's really important to be proud of who you are and your heritage. I don't care whether it be Mexican, Chinese, or whatever. You have to be proud of who you are in your history. culture changes over time. That's the other part. If you had been here 50 years ago and talked to Mexican American, they had a different perspective. Today, my guess is your children don't speak Spanish. They may be English, but as time goes on, the culture changes and people change. But you always have to be proud of where you came from and who you are. There was a movement in the early part of the century that wanted to Americanize everybody. If you were Native American, they cut your hair, punished them for speaking their language. That was wrong. And they tried to do the same thing with the Mexican American. Most people don't realize, but Friendly House was started on an Americanization movement to Americanize. And later we found that's not healthy. It's not good. You've got to be proud of who you are, of your history, your heritage. That would make a good person.
We'll end on that note. Thank you so very much. I really hope you enjoyed this show. This was AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. Have a great week.
Arizona Hispanic Connection.